just got this morning from one of our European offices a urgent appeal. This is a tiger in the crosshairs of a telescopic sight. It's an urgent appeal from the World Wildlife Fund saying this is probably the most urgent appeal that they've ever launched. And they point out the fact that a number of species face extinction. Now that latter point is true. And it's true because they directly, and in some cases Prince Philip personally, killed these animal species. The WWF at its founding in 1961 took under its wing, in particular, the African elephant, the African rhino, the Indian rhino, the panda, and a few others. Now, the African elephant was, had a population of about 3 million when the World Wildlife Fund was founded. Today, it's several hundred thousand. The African rhino had a population of 100,000. Today, it is virtually extinct in the wild. The panda, as Prince Philip said in 1990, is almost certainly doomed, although they're trying to take over vast areas of China to try and put forward panda parks to allegedly save this thing, and so forth and so on. Prince Philip, a couple of months before the WWF was founded in 1961, went on a hunt, a tiger hunt, in northern India and slaughtered a bunch of tigers. Now, of course, the tiger is precisely what they're saying is going extinct. The Indian tiger is going extinct now. Now, there's a total uproar around the world about Prince Philip killing all these tigers. So, as he continued on his travels, he put a bandage on his trigger finger. And he participated in another hunt, but with this big bandage there, so well, I can't possibly shoot anything. Now, he and Queen Elizabeth with her home camera whirring away, mounted, as part of a broader party, 300 elephants, and they went out to kill more tigers and other species. Now, Prince Philip, as the elephants started closing in on various kinds of game, a extremely rare Indian rhinoceros, of which there were only 250 in the whole world at that time, came within the circle of elephants. All of the royal party were horrified because they knew that Prince Philip would shoot it. So various people tried to shoot near the rhino to scare him away, etc. As the rhino kept blundering on, Prince Philip took aim and bam. So there were 249 left in the entire world. Now, if the WWF has not been protecting the animals under its purview, what has it been doing? Well, in order to understand that, you have to go back a bit in history and look at the two key institutions which came together to found the WWF in 1961. They are, number one, the Society for the Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the Empire, of course the British Empire. Number two, the Eugenics Society of Great Britain with its arms in the United States, continental Europe, and elsewhere. Now, in the 1880s and 1890s, as you're all aware, there was a mad scramble among the European colonial powers for domination and territory in Africa. By 1900, a convention was pulled together in London under the auspices of the British Empire to basically set up a series of areas where the native populations who had been conquered would not be allowed in as part of the population control programs of the empire at that time. In 1903, to formalize and to carry this work further, the Society for the Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the Empire was established. The people who established it were the leading lights, the legend of British imperial history. Lords Milner, Curzon, Minto, Cromer, Grey, the great imperial proconsuls of the New Rome. They put this operation together, and throughout the decades, what they sponsored most in particular, their key job was to found national parks, beginning in Africa but then expanding all over the world. In 1933, and again in 38, the fauna, as it was called by its oligarchical members, pulled together conferences to set up international parks. Now, I give you a certain sense of what Africa looks like in its modern form today, and without the work of the fauna continued by the WWF, it is absolutely impossible to understand modern African history, nor, for that matter, increasingly the history of the rest of the globe. Could we have the first slide, please? This is Africa. The dark splotches are the so-called protected areas. In general, if you're an African and you go into a protected area, you will either be shot and killed, or if you're taken captive, you will be subject to disciplinary measures, including confiscation of your goods, your home, thrown in prison, etc. The percentage of the African continent now taken up in these protected areas is nominally 8.2%, according to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is one of the WWF co-thinker groups. In reality, it's much higher than that. So the idea, as with the enclosures in the Highlands in Scotland in the 17th and 18th centuries, was to set up broad areas of the countries where the subject population was not allowed to go, the better for imperial control. Now, the WWF manages and in fact runs the game parks in 5 of these African countries directly under its own name. That is, the countries themselves do not run anywhere from 8 to 40% of their national territory. It is run by a supranational body, the WWF. In 5 countries, that's directly the case. In about another dozen more, it's indirectly the case. And in some sense, through training of their disciples as game wardens, it's the case in virtually every single African country. So that's one. That's the first institution which helped found the WWF, is the Society for the Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the Empire. The second, which is much more crucial ideologically, is the Eugenics Society. Eugenics means racial purity, race science. The thesis is that certain kinds of skin colors bespeak a moral and racial superiority to other kinds of allegedly inferior skin colors. Now, this was put together beginning around the 1860s and 1870s by a series of people, including Darwin, including T.H. Huxley, so-called Darwin's bulldog. Using the work of Thomas Malthus, they cooked up a theory of the survival of the fittest. And whoever survived, they said, naturally was the most fit to survive. But they said that, therefore, since the British Empire was ruling the globe, clearly the British, and adding a few Americans in perhaps of their type, this was the most superior racial group which existed. And you will see throughout the work of the WWF, the founding of the WWF and through until today, an intermarried tribe of people, the Darwin-Huxley grouping, using this work of Malthus, which in fact goes back to Venice in the way that Webster had identified, a small amount of land and too much population spreading and spreading and spreading. Well, what's the basis under which we're going to deal with this problem? Well, we cull the human herd. On what basis do we know how and who to cull? That's the science of eugenics. Julian Huxley, when he founded the WWF in 1961, was also the president of one of the most important institutions of British intelligence, far above MI5 and MI6, the Eugenics Society. Huxley, when he was the head of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization, which was founded in 1945-46. Now remember, World War II had just ended. Hitler was associated with a heinous doctrine of eugenics, which of course is mass genocide, right? That's what the concentration camps were for, to get rid of the gypsies, the Jews, other people, perhaps of Mediterranean races, so-called. Well, eugenics had become a bit unfashionable. Here's what Julian Huxley wrote into the founding document of UNESCO. Thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, so that much now that is unthinkable may at least become thinkable. What the founding of the WWF in '61, this had been prepared already in the 1930s in the very direct sense. Huxley, at that time, was research director of a thing called the PEP, the Political and Planning Unit of Chatham House, that is the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the think tank for the British Foreign Office. The guy who was director was Max Nicholson. And if you go back and read their own writings, what they say is, we need population control, raw materials control, and a world government to assure control of the former two. That is what will define our work in the post-war period. They said that before there was a war, They and their associates in the nexuses that Jeff Steinberg outlined, they pushed the war and they consolidated the shape of things to come after the war, in which this establishment of these vast supranational game parks was absolutely crucial to their design. Their design to cull the human herd. Now, can we have the first of the game parks maps, please? Okay. Now, I don't want to go into at great length all of the game parks that are established here. Just point out a couple of indicative ones and their role. Now, first of all, you notice from this map as well as the previous map that most of these game parks are established on border areas. Now, for those of you familiar with African history, when the maps were drawn up in London, they were totally random. Most African countries are not demarcated by rivers, by mountain ranges, and so forth, right? So the placement of the game parks on the borders was done for a reason. They could have put them anywhere. They were placed on the border to have maximum cross-border control and destabilization capability. Now let's look at some of the, just again, a couple of the indicative points here. This is the West Zambezi Game Reserve, a game management area, as it's formally called, in Zambia. That's where both the MPLA and its UNITA opposition for Angola were trained. The ANC was trained down here, as was also SWAPO, right, in number 2, is just below the west, actually contiguous as part of the Zambezi Game Reserve, although called by a different name. SWAPO was trained there. Here in the Etosha Game Reserve in Namibia were trained the assassins who conduct the third force black-on-black violence in South Africa. And I think most people are aware of how that works. Inkatha allegedly goes and slaughters some people of the ANC. The ANC returned the slaughter, and away you go. In reality, most of this and the continuing perpetuation of it is not done by Inkatha and ANC. It's done by a so-called third force. And the third force has been trained here at Etosha, here in KwaZulu, and here on the border of Mozambique in another game reserve. The Kruger National Park, 20,000 square kilometers, larger than the state of Massachusetts in the United States. This is Renamo's headquarters for the savage civil war which is going on in Mozambique. Now, how do these things work? The gangs, as the British call them, and the pseudo-gangs are both financed and orchestrated by British intelligence. Now, this does not say that there are not people striving the best they know for freedom, for national sovereignty, and so forth within the vehicles that they find available to them. Of course. That's the essence of the national tragedy that you see unfold in African nation after African nation. If you look at the post-war period, the great dreams of 1961, the late 50s and the early 60s, for true sovereignty, true independence at last, were perverted and destroyed precisely through these measures. The establishment of the game preserves, and then the running of mass assassination, terror, and gangs and pseudo-gangs out of those reserves. And you see the results, right? You see the results in Mozambique, which has barely reached a precarious kind of a peace in the recent election, but with how many hundreds of thousands slaughtered, how many tens of billions of dollars of damage, a minimum of 500,000 people killed in Angola, minimum, probably much more than that, a minimum recorded $40 billion in damage, a minimum 10,000 people slaughtered, black Africans slaughtered, simply since Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, and so on and so forth as it goes, right? Zambia was the staging area. You see the percentage of Zambia taken up by national parks. Virtually all of the gangs and pseudo-gangs of modern African history came out of Zambia. Similarly, for other parts, Tanzania also had a major role in this thing. You will notice, in the case of Tanzania, you'll notice that this is actually very deceptive. 40% of the entire territory of the nation of Tanzania is not under Tanzanian national control. It's under WWF control. Okay, I think that's sufficient for that. Could we have the next map, please? Okay, here we're looking at, this is basically Eastern Africa. I don't want to spend a lot of time here. Let me just point out one crucial point. This is the Kidepo Valley National Park in northern Uganda. What you see here, this is contiguous to Sudan, of course, right? This is where the SPLA rebels are based. Tony Rowland announced himself as the commander of the SPLA in a radio interview in 1993. Tony Rowland, of course, financed UNITA on the one side, and the MPLA on the other side, financed Frelimo on one side, and financed Renamo on the other side, financed the Afrikaner government on the one hand, financed the ANC on the other hand, financed the Smith white minority regime in Rhodesia on the one hand, financed ZAPU and ZANU on the other hand. What Roland did, and Roland's company was put together through the personal fortune of the Crown. The company was never anything but that, right? What Ronro did is what all of these groups, ICI, Unilever, Royal Dutch Shell, you name them, that is what they do. That is documented. That is a matter of fact. I think we'll look at some of these other things. Again, these are other areas, which a massive train. This is the famous Serengeti National Park, right, in northern Tanzania. The Ngorongoro crater area. Again, massive guerrilla training of all sorts there. Red Chinese in the past, Russian, various of the South African, the ANC had people trained there, the PAC in particular had people trained there, so forth and so on as it goes. You remember the famous movie, some of you, The Serengeti Shall Not Die, the famous movie of the 1950s? That was the propaganda piece to establish this gigantic border of, cross-border territory for a staging ground for guerrilla activities. It's been proven, by the way, since all of the native peoples who used to be living in the Serengeti, in particular the Maasai tribesmen, have been driven out. It's been proven without any question that since there's no people in the park and no poachers have been caught in 3 years, the reason why the rhinos and the elephants are being slaughtered in the park is because the WWF paid game guards are killing them. With the WWF, of course, well aware of this. This, I think, kind of really brings the picture home. Now, what we're looking at, of course, is Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and eastern Zaire. Now, in both 1990 and in the April 1994 invasions, they were organized, equipped, established, and the training for these invasions took place out of the national parks in these border areas. Both invasions in 1990 and 1994 came through the game park. This is the Akagera National Park in northeast Rwanda, contiguous to Uganda. This is the main staging area, by the way, for the 1994 invasion. This is a savanna. This is a grassy plain. It's where you can bring up tanks, heavy equipment, and so forth in staging area. More important in the 1990 invasion, which is really what set up the stage for the current slaughter that happened in 1994, if you follow the history of this thing carefully. What we're looking at here is the Gorilla National Park in Uganda, number one. Number two, the so-called volcans, the French name, the Volcanic National Park in northwest Rwanda, and you're looking at the Virunga Park in eastern Zaire. They come together at that tri-national area. That is where the guerrillas were established, giving a new meaning, of course, to the famous film Gorillas in the Mist. If any of you have the work of Diane Fossey and the famous mountain gorillas in northern Rwanda, well, this is the kind of gorillas that the WWF likes is the Guerilla type. So this is how this thing was done. Now, in 1980, the invasion was in 1990, right? In the latter part of 1990, October, I believe it was. What happened in late 89 and early in 1990 was massive efforts were set up to save the elephants of Uganda and to save the gorillas of Rwanda. Now that was interesting because there's not many elephants in the gorilla park in Uganda. The elephants, in fact, are hundreds and hundreds of miles up to the north in the Murchison National Park. So they flew in massive amounts of military equipment to fight poachers, in the case of both so-called for the elephants on the one hand to save them and to save the gorillas on the other hand. And what that was used to do was to arm and train the RPF, which was otherwise simply a unit of the Ugandan army. And anyone who knows anything about the area knows that to be true and knows that they were organized, financed, and trained by British intelligence and British SAS. That's the way the thing worked. Now, I want to draw your attention to one of the more famous of the WWF's conservation projects in the recent period, which will give you a little bit of a sense of how these guys tend to work. There was an operation put together about 1986, 1987 called Operation Locke. Prince Bernhard, this former Nazi, who was called by the U.S. House of Representatives House Committee on Un-American Activities, one of the most dangerous Nazi spies that the U.S. was confronted with. Prince Bernhard took a tour of Africa, together with a guy who would become the head of Africa programs for the WWF, a guy named John Hanks. And they found that poaching was a massive problem all over Africa. And they wanted to deal with poaching, and they thought, well, maybe we have to deal with this in an unorthodox fashion. Let's really get into this problem, even if we have to break some laws to do it. What the WWF financed then, to the tune of well over $1 million, nobody knows how many millions were involved, they sent a squadron of 25 of the most elite of the British Special Air Services units, the legendary SAS units, down into Africa to allegedly infiltrate the poaching rings and gather intelligence and carry out actions against these poachers. Now look at who they organized to do this. The person who was the head of Operation Lock was the legendary Colonel David Sterling, the guy who founded the SAS during World War II. Colonel David Sterling has been the personal bodyguard of the Queen since 1952. He was the so-called gold stick in the coronation of Queen Elizabeth as Queen in that year. The gold stick is what the British oligarchy will virtually kill each other for. That is the person who's entrusted with the safety of the personal body of the crown, of the monarch, right? That was Sterling. Sterling chose as his chief operations officer, many of you remember perhaps the Kurdish, what was it, I guess the Kurdish assault on the Iranian embassy in London some years ago, where you had the legendary, the man on the balcony, right, the guy with the hooded mask, right, who was standing there with a machine gun ready to break in and take the embassy back. That was Colonel Crook, who was the head of one of the two SAS regiments, the most highly decorated figure in the Falkland Islands fighting, and the man scheduled to take over the number 1 unit, 22 SAS, which was the prime elite fighting unit of the entire British Empire. But no, he doesn't take up that position. And the man who founded the SAS, these two get together, they take 25 hand-picked veterans, including the most decorated Falklands people, the most decorated Northern Ireland SAS veterans, and they send them down into South Africa. So what'd they do? Well, they trained game guards. That's mostly what they did. They also flew a helicopter in Zimbabwe. This helicopter killed hundreds of people. Of the 380 people killed or wounded or who were, in some cases, escaped, they only found 100 guns. So most of the people who were slaughtered, most of the human beings who were slaughtered from the WWF paid for and WWF run helicopter gunships in Zimbabwe were unarmed. Some of the rest of them were members of the military wing of the ANC. Some of the rest of them were opponents of Robert Mugabe, who spoke out against the IMF program, which was crushing Zimbabwe's economy at that point. So that's one thing they did. They slaughtered they slaughtered the so-called poachers. The last living rhino herd in the wild, 700 rhinos, was destroyed by the WWF. It was slaughtered when they paid for it, and the ones that weren't slaughtered were drugged and were sent off to game farms in Australia, the United States, and elsewhere among Prince Philip's cronies in the 1001 Club. That's why there's no rhinos left in the wild to speak of, because Prince Philip and his gang killed them all. But let's go back to this question of training the game guards, the park rangers, right? And anybody knows how the Mau Mau thing was run in Kenya has a sense of this. The whole Mau Mau operation was run in order to commit genocide against the Kikuyu tribe, because it's a majority tribe, and whenever you have a majority tribe and independence coming into power, you have the possibility of stability and sovereignty. Why? Because they're the majority. The British policy, as anyone, again, who knows Africa history is quite aware, is to put a minority in power, a minority tribe, and to keep them always at war amongst each other. So out of the parks, and using the game wardens of the parks, the British cooked up, largely, the so-called Mau Mau insurgency, and then slaughtered tens of thousands of Kenyans, mostly Kikuyu, but others as well, to set the conditions for the kind of government they wanted in Kenya in the post-war period. So what were they doing down here? What were they doing in Africa, in southern Africa, in 1988, 1989, 1990, and still to today? Training the game guards. Well, some of the game guards, I pointed out Etosha Park in Namibia. Those game guards, which they were formerly called the Kerfoot Unit, that is, it's Afrikaans, an Afrikaans term, the Crowbar Squad, were notorious for their butchery and their savagery. They were black units, right? Used against SWAPO in the Namibian Liberation War. Now, this is not to choose sides or anything like that, because the British play all sides against the middle, but that's who they were, the Kerfoot units, on the side of the minority government at that point. Now, these Kerfoot units were retrained in 88, in 89, and in 90, there in Etosha National Park, by WWF people, by Sterling's people, by Colonel Crook and others, the aptly named Colonel Crook, I might add. And later on, these game guards, these former Kerfoot people, constituted the stock theft unit in South Africa, of the South African police. Many of you remember the Boy Patong massacre in 1992 in South Africa. 39 people slaughtered and dozens more injured, right? Again, third force violence at a crucial point in the transition, the political transition there. Who did it turn out to be that was named by both prominent white and black circles, including ANC intelligence, including the Goldstone Commission and so forth in South Africa, that carried out the slaughter, but the stock theft unit? Where were they based? They were based at Goldfields Mine, at a mine owned by the British company Goldfields. Who's Goldfields? Its chief executive is a long-time key figure in the 1001 Club and in the WWF. That's the way this thing works. When we say that Prince Philip is guilty of genocide, that charge can be backed up chapter and verse. He says it, as Jeff Steinberg indicated, he says, I want to kill people. His eugenics society has said, and the founders of the WWF, which came out of the eugenics society, have said again and again and again, we want to kill black people, brown people, etc. I have some beautiful quotes, horrible but beautiful, which I'll read in the question period if it comes up again. They say they want to kill people, and then they set up an institution which goes out and conducts in its own name, under cover of saving the animals, the slaughter that does result in precisely the extinction that they called for. So I submit, as Mr. LaRouche would say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as the person who has drawn up, Mr. LaRouche is the person who's drawn up the bill of indictment on this crowd, that these people are guilty as charged. I think the evidence is overwhelming. It's begun to break in the London press. The mass circulation of the People, which is a Sunday press over there, sort of a sex and scandal sheet, but read by 5.6 million people every Sunday. That broke these charges, and you're going to hear these charges echoing around the world in the period to come. Thank you.